The Fifth Trip, or Geburah. Swift Kick, Inc. And behold, thusly was the law formulated. Imposition of order equals escalation of chaos. Lord O'Makayam Ravenhurst, The Gospel According to Fred, The Honest Book of Truth. The lights flashed, the computer buzzed. Hagbard attached the electrodes. On January the 30th, 1939, a silly little man in Berlin gave a silly little speech. Among other things he said,
"And another thing I wish to say on this day, which is perhaps most memorable not only for us Germans. In my life I have been many times a prophet, and most of the times I have been laughed at. During the period of my struggle for power, it was in the first case the Jews that laughed at my prophecies that someday I would take over the leadership of the state and thereby the whole folk, and that I would, among others, solve also the Jewish problem. I believe that in the meantime the hyena-like laughter of the Jews of Germany has been smothered in their throats. Today I want to be a prophet once more. If the international finance Jews inside and outside Europe should succeed once more in plunging nations into another world war, the consequence will be the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe."
And so on. He was always saying things like that. By 1939, quite a few heads here and there realized that the silly little man was also a murderous little monster. But only a very small number, even of these, noticed that for the first time in his anti-Semitic diatribes, he had used the word Vernichtung, annihilation, and even they couldn't believe he meant what that implied. In fact, outside of a small circle of friends, nobody guessed what the little man, Adolf Hitler, had planned. Outside that small, very small circle of friends, others came in intimate contact with Der Führer and never guessed what was in his mind. Hermann Rauschning, the governor of Danzig, for instance, was a devout Nazi, until he began to get some hints of where Hitler's fancies were tending. After fleeing to France, Rauschning wrote a book warning against his former leader. It was called The Voice of Destruction, and was very eloquent, but the most interesting passages in it were not understood by Rauschning, or by most of his readers.
Whoever sees in National Socialism nothing but a political movement doesn't know much about it,
Hitler told Rauschning, and this is in the book. But Rauschning and his readers continued to see National Socialism as a particularly vile and dangerous political movement, and nothing more.
"Creation is not yet completed,"
Hitler said again, and Rauschning again recorded without understanding.
"The planet will undergo an upheaval which you, uninitiated people, can't understand."
Der Führer warned on another occasion, and still another time, he remarked that Nazism was not only more than a political movement, but
more than a new religion.
And Rauschning wrote it all and understood none of it. He even recorded the testimony of Hitler's physician, that the silly and murderous little man often awoke screaming from nightmares that were truly extraordinary in their intensity, and would shout,
"It's him! It's him! He's come for me!"
Good old Hermann Rauschning, a German of the old school and not equipped to participate in the new Germany of National Socialism, took all this as evidence of mental unbalance in Hitler.
"All of them coming back, all of them, Hitler and Stryker and Goebbels and the powers behind them, what look like something you can't even imagine, governor. You think they was human?"
The patient went on as the psychiatrist listened in astonishment.
"But wait till you see them the second time, and they're coming. By the end of the month, they're coming."
Karl Haushofer was never tried at Nuremberg. Ask most people to name the men chiefly responsible for the Vernichtung, annihilation, decision, and his name will not be mentioned. Even most histories of Nazi Germany relegate him to footnotes. But strange stories are told about his many visits to Tibet, Japan, and other parts of the Orient. His gift for prophecy and clairvoyance. The legend that he belonged to a bizarre sect of dissident and most peculiar Buddhists, who had entrusted him with a mission in the Western world so serious that he vowed to commit suicide if he did not succeed. If the last yarn is true, Haushofer must have failed in his mission, for in March 1946 he killed his wife Martha and then performed the Japanese suicide rite of seppuku upon himself. His son, Albrecht, had already been executed for his role in the officers' plot to assassinate Hitler. Of his father, Albrecht had written in a poem, "My father broke the seal. He did not feel the breath of the evil one. He set it free to roam the world." It was Karl Haushofer, clairvoyant, mystic, medium, orientalist, and fanatic believer in the lost continent of Thule, who introduced Hitler to the Illuminated Lodge in Munich in 1923. Shortly thereafter, Hitler made his first bid to seize power. No rational interpretation of the events of August 1968 in Chicago, satisfactory to all participants and observers, has yet been produced. This suggests the need for value-free models, inspired by the structural analysis in von Neumann and Morgenstern's theory of games and economic behavior, which will allow us to express what actually occurred functionally, without tainting our analysis with bias or moral judgments. The model we will employ is that of the two teams, an uphill motorcar race and a downhill bicycle race, accidentally intersecting on the same hill. The Picasso statue in the Civic Centre will be regarded as start for the downhill motor race and finish for the uphill bicycle race. Pontius Pilate, disguised as Sirhan, fires the opening shot, thereby disqualifying Robert F. Kennedy, for whom Marilyn Monroe committed suicide, as recorded in the most trustworthy tabloids and scandal sheets. This is the voice of your friendly neighbourhood Spider-Man speaking. You must realise that you are not Joseph Wendell Malick. Hell's Angels on motorcycles do not fit the structure of the race at all, so they endlessly orbit around the heroic statue of General Logan in Grant Park. Finish for the uphill crucifixion racers, and can be considered as isolated from the action, which is, of course, America. When Jesus falls the first time, this can be considered as a puncture, and Simon operates an air pump on his tyres. But the threat to throw LSD in the water supply constitutes a foul, and this team thereby is driven back 3 squares by mace, clubs, and the machine guns of the Capone mob, unleashed from another time track in the same multiverse. Willard Gibbs, far more than Einstein, created the modern cosmos, and his concept of contingent or statistical reality, when cross-fertilized with the second law of thermodynamics by Shannon and Wiener, led to the definition of information as the negative reciprocal of probability, making the clubbings of Jesus by Chicago cops just another of those things that happen in this kind of quantum jump. A centurion named Semper Cuni Linctus passes Simon in Grant Park looking for the uphill bike race.
"When we crucify a man,"
he mutters,
"he should confounded well stay crucified."
The 3 Marys clutch handkerchiefs to their faces as the tear gas and Cyclone B pours upward on the hill, to the spot where the crosses and the statue of General Logan stand.
Nor dashed 1,000 Kim,
croons St. Toad, looking through the door at Fission Chips. Arthur Flagenheimer and Robert Putney Drake ascend the chimney.
You don't have to believe in Santa Claus.
H.P. Lovecraft explains.
Ambrose,
the Dutchman says to him imploringly.
But it can't be,
Joe Malik says, half weeping.
It can't be that crazy. Buildings wouldn't stand, planes wouldn't fly, dams would collapse, engineering colleges would be lunatic asylums. They aren't already?
Simon asks.
Have you read the latest data on the ecological catastrophe? You gotta face it, Joe. God is a crazy woman. There are no straight lines in curved space.
Stella adds.
But my mind is dying.
Joe protests, shuddering. Simon holds up an ear of corn and tells him urgently,
Osiris is a black god.
Sir Charles James Napier, bearded, long-haired and 60-odd years old, General of Her Majesty's armies in India, met a most engaging scoundrel in January 1843 and immediately wrote to his cronies in England about this remarkable person whom he described as brave, clever, fabulously wealthy and totally unscrupulous. Since this curious fellow was also regarded as God by his followers, who numbered over 3 million, he charged 20 rupees for permission to kiss his hand, asked and got the sexual favours of the wives or daughters of any true believers who took his fancy, and proved his divinity by brazenly and openly committing sins which any mortal would shrivel with shame to have acknowledged. He also proved at the Battle of Mayani, where he aided the British against the rebellious Baluchi tribesmen, that he could fight like 10 tigers. All in all, General Napier concluded, a most unusual human being. Hassan Ali Shah Mahalat, 46th Imam, or living god, of the Ismailian sect of Islam, direct descendant of Hassan-i Sabah and first Aga Khan.
Dear Joe, I'm back in Chicago again, fabulous Demesne of Crooked-Back Richard, Pig Bashard of the world, etc., where the pollution comes up like thunder out of Gary across the lake, etc., and the Padre and I are still working on the heads of the local heads, etc., so I finally got time to write to you that long letter I promised. The Law of Fives is all the farther that Weishaupt ever got. And Hagbard and John aren't much interested in any further speculations along those lines. The 2317 phenomenon is entirely my discovery, except that William S. Burroughs has noted the 23 without coming to any conclusions about it. I'm writing this on a bench in Grant Park near the place I got maced 3 years ago. Nice symbolism. A woman just came along from the Mother's March Against Polio. I gave her a quarter. What a drag. Just when I was trying to get my thoughts in order. When you come out here, I'll be able to tell you more. This will obviously have to be somewhat sketchy. Burroughs, anyway, encountered the 23 in Tangiers when a ferryboat captain named Clark remarked that he'd been sailing 23 years without an accident. That day, his ship sunk, with all hands and feet aboard. Burroughs was thinking about it in the evening when the radio newscast told him that an Eastern Airlines plane, New York to Miami, had crashed. The pilot was another Captain Clark, and the plane was Flight 23. If you want to know the extent of their control,
Simon told Joe, speaking this time, not writing a letter. They were driving to San Francisco after leaving Dillinger.
Take a dollar bill out of your wallet and look at it. Go ahead, do it now. I want to make a point.
Joe took out his wallet and looked for a single. A year later, in the city Simon called Czech Argo, in honour of the synchronous invasion in August 1968, the KCUF convention is taking its first luncheon break after Smiling Jim Socket Tum's opening speech. Simon brushes against an usher, shouts,
"Hey, you damn faggot, keep your hands off my ass!"
And in the ensuing tumult, Joe has no trouble slipping the AUM in the punch.
Do I have to get a library card just to look at one book?
Carmel asked the librarian in the main branch of the Las Vegas library, after Maldonado had failed to produce any lead to a communist agent.
And the most puzzling acts of Washington's presidency.
Professor Percival Pt.1 tells an American history class at Columbia back in '68.
Was his refusal to aid Tom Paine when Paine was condemned to death in Paris.
Why puzzling, George Torn thinks in the back of the class. Washington was an establishment fink.
First of all, look at the face on the front,
Simon says.
It isn't Washington at all. It's Weishaupt. Compare it with any of the early authentic pictures of Washington and you'll see what I mean. And look at that cryptic half-smile on his face.
The same smile Weishaupt wore when he finished the letter explaining to Paine why he couldn't help him. Sealed it with the Great Seal of the United States, whose meaning only he knew, and settling back in his chair, murmured to himself,
Jacques de Molay, thou art again avenged.
What do you mean I'm creating a disturbance? It was that faggot there with his big mitts on my ass.
Well, I don't know which particular book, honey. Something that tells me how the communists work. You know, how a patriotic citizen can spot a commie spy ring if there's one in his neighborhood. That kind of thing.
Carmel explained. A swarm of men in blue shirts and white plastic helmets rushes down the steps at 43rd Street and UN Plaza, past the inscription reading, They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Neither shall they study war any more. Waving heavy wooden crosses and shouting angry battle cries, the helmeted men surge into the crowd like a wave hitting a sandcastle. George sees them coming and his heart skips a beat.
And when you turn the bill over, the first thing you see is the Illuminati Pyramid. You'll notice it says 1776 on it, but our government was founded in 1788. Supposedly, the 1776 is there because that's when the Declaration of Independence was signed. The real reason is that 1776 is the year Weishaupt revived the Illuminati. And why do you suppose the pyramid has 72 segments in 13 layers?
Simon asks in 1969.
Misunderstanding my eye. When a guy gropes my butt that way, I know exactly what he wants.
Simon shouts in 1970. George nudges Peter Jackson.
God's lightning,
he says. The plastic hats gleam in the sunlight, more of them jostling down the stairs. A banner, red letters on a white background, unfurling above. America, love it or we'll stomp you.
Christ on roller skates,
Peter says.
Now watch the cops do a vanishing act.
Dillinger settles down cross-legged in a 5-sided chamber under the UN meditating room. He curls into the lotus posture with an ease that would appear unusual in an American in his late 60s, were there anyone to witness it.
72 is the Kabbalistic number for the holy, unspeakable name of God used in all black magic, and 13 is the number in a coven.
Simon explains.
That's why.
The Volkswagen purrs towards San Francisco. Carmel comes down the steps of the Las Vegas Public Library, a copy of J. Edgar Hoover's Masters of Deceit under his arm, an anticipatory smirk on his face. And Simon is finally ejected from the Sheraton Chicago, shouting,
"Faggots! I think you're all a bunch of faggots!" And here's one of their jokes.
Simon adds,
"Over the eagle's head, do you dig that Star of David? They put that one in, that one single 6-pointed Jewish star made up of all the 5-pointed stars, just so some right-wing cranks could find it and proclaim it as proof that the elders of Zion control the Treasury and the Federal Reserve."
Overlooking the crowd in UN Plaza, Zev Hirsch, New York State commander of God's Lightning, watches his thick-shouldered troops swinging their wooden crosses like tomahawks and drive back the lily-livered peaceniks. There is an obstacle. A blue line of policemen has formed between the men of God's lightning and their prey. Over the cops' shoulders, the peaceniks are screeching dirty words at their plastic-hatted enemies. Zev's eyes scan the crowd. He catches the eye of a red-faced cop with gold braid on his cap. Zev gives the police captain a questioning look. The captain winks. A minute later, the captain makes a small gesture with his left hand. Immediately, the line of police vanishes as if melted in the bright spring sun that beats down on the plaza. The battalion of God's lightning falls upon their anguished, outraged and astonished victims. Zev Hirsch laughs. This is a lot more fun than the old days in the Jewish Defence League. All the servants are drunk, and the rain continues. At an outdoor cafe in Jerusalem, 2 white-haired old men wearing black are drinking coffee together. They try to mask their emotions from the people around them, but their eyes are wild with excitement. They are staring at an inside page of a Yiddish newspaper, reading 2 ads in Yiddish, a large quarter-page announcement of the greatest rock festival of all time to be held near Ingolstadt, Bavaria, bands of all nations, people of all nations, to be known as Woodstock, Europa. On the same page is the paper's personals column, and the watery eyes of the 2 old men are rereading for the 5th time the statement in Yiddish. In thanks to St. Jude for favours granted. A.W. One old man points at the page with a trembling finger.
It is coming,
he says in German. The other one nods, a beatific smile on his withered face.
Jawohl, it is coming very soon. The Tag. Soon we must to Bavaria go. Ewiger Blumenkraft.
Carlo put the gun on the table between us.
This is it, George,
he said.
Are you a revolutionary, or are you just on an ego trip, playing at being a revolutionary? Can you take the gun?
I wiped my eyes. The Passaic was flamed below me. A steady stream of garbage from the Patterson Falls down to Newark and the Atlantic Ocean. Like the garbage, that was my contemptible, cowardly soul. The God's Lightning Troopers fan out, clubbing each person wearing an I won't die for Fernando Poo button. Blood dances in the air, fragile red bubbles, before the tomb-like slab of the UN building. Dillinger's breathing slows down. He stares at the ruby eye atop the 13-step pyramid hidden in the UN building, and he thinks of pentagons.
I'm a God's lightning,
Carlo said.
This is no joke, baby. I'm gonna do the whole bit.
His intense eyes burned into mine as the switchblade came out of his pocket.
Motherfucking commie,
he screamed suddenly, leaping up so quickly that the chair fell over behind him.
You're not getting off with a beating this time. I'm gonna cut your balls off and take them home as a souvenir.
He slashed forward with the knife, deflecting his swing at the last minute.
Made you jump, you long-haired faggoty freak. I wonder if you have any balls to cut off. Well, I'll find out.
He inched forward, the knife weaving snake-like patterns in the air.
Look,
I said desperately.
I know you're only play acting. You don't know nothing, baby. Maybe I'm FBI or CIA. Maybe this is just an excuse to get you to go for the gun so I can kill you and claim self-defense. Life isn't all demonstrations and play acting, George. There comes a time when it gets serious.
He lunged again with the knife, and I stumbled clumsily backward.
Are you gonna take the gun, or am I gonna cut your balls off and tell the group you're no fucking good and we couldn't use you?
He was totally mad, and I was totally sane. Is that a more flattering way of telling it, instead of the truth? That he was brave, and I was yellow.
Listen,
I said.
I know you won't really stab me, and you know I won't really shoot you. Shit on you know and I know.
Carlo hit me in the chest with his free hand. Hard.
I'm a God's Latin and really a God's Latin, and I'm gonna do the whole scene. This is a test, but the test is for real.
He hit me again, jarring my balance, and slapped my face twice, rapidly, back and forth like a windshield wiper.
I always said you long-haired commie freaks don't have no guts. You can't even fight back. You can't even feel angry, can you? You just feel sorry for yourself, right?
It was too damn true. A nerve twinged deep down inside at the unfairness of it, of his ability to see into me more than I usually dared see into myself. And at last, I grabbed the gun from the table, screaming,
"You sadistic Stalinist son of a bitch!"
And look at the eagle,
Simon says.
Look real close. That ain't really no olive branch in his left claw, baby. That's our old friend Maria Warner. You never really looked at a dollar bill before, did you? And the real symbolism of the pyramid is alchemical, of course. The traditional code represents the three kinds of sex by a cube, a pyramid, and a sphere. The cube is that travesty we call normal sex, in which the two nervous systems never actually merge at the orgasm, like the two parallel sides of a cube. The pyramid is the two coming together and joining, the magical telepathic orgasm. The sphere is the tantric ritual, endlessly prolonged with no orgasm at all. The alchemists used that code for over 2,000 years. The Rosicrucians among the founding fathers used the pyramid as a symbol for their kind of sex magic. Aleister Crowley used that symbol the same way more recently. The eye on the pyramid is the two minds meeting, neurological interlock, the opening of the eye of Shiva, ewige Schlangenkraft, the eternal serpent power, the joining of the rose and cross, vagina and penis, into rose cross, the astral leap, mind escaping from physiology.
The AUM was supposed to work almost instantly, according to what the scientists at ELF had told Hagbard. So Joe approached the first man who had sampled the punch and started a conversation.
Nice talk Smiling Jim gave,
he said earnestly. I rammed the gun into Carlo's gut and saw him go white about the lips.
No, don't worry,
I said, smiling.
I'm not using it on you, but when I come back, there'll be a dead pig on the street somewhere in Morningside Heights.
He started to speak, and I jabbed downwards with the gun, grinning as he gasped for air.
Comrade,
I added.
Yeah, Smiling Jim was born with a silver tongue,
The other man said.
A silver tongue?
Joe agreed solemnly, then added, holding out his hand.
By the way, I'm Jim Mallison from the New York delegation. Knew by your accent.
The other said shrewdly.
I'm Clem Kotex from down Little Rock.
They shook.
Pleasure to meet you. Too bad about that kid that got thrown out,
Joe said, lowering his voice.
It looked to me like that usher really was, touching him.
Kotex looked surprised for a moment, but then shook his head in doubt.
Can't tell nowadays, especially in big cities. Do you really think an Andy Frayn usher could be a fairy? Like you said, nowadays in big cities.
Joe shrugged.
I'm just saying that it looked like it to me. Of course, maybe the usher isn't one. Maybe he's just a cheap thief who's trying to pick the kid's pocket. A lot of that goes on these days, too.
Kotex involuntarily reached back to check his own wallet, and Joe went on blandly.
But I wouldn't rule out the other, not by a long shot. What sort of man would want to be an usher at a KCUF meeting, if you stop and think about it? You must have observed how many homosexuals there are in our organization. What?
Kotex's eyes bulged.
You haven't noticed it?
Joe smiled loftily.
There are very few of us who are really Christians. Most of the membership are just a little bit lavender, you know what I mean? I think it's one of our biggest problems, and we ought to bring it out into the open and discuss it frankly, clear the air, right? For instance, take the way Smiling Jim always puts his arm around your shoulder when he talks to you.
Kotex interrupted.
Hey, mister, you're pretty darn bright. Just now, hit me like a flash. Some of the men here, When Smiling Jim showed those beaver shots to prove how bad some magazines are getting, they really shuddered. They didn't just disapprove. It really, honest to Pete, revolted them. What kind of man actually finds a naked lady disgusting?
Go, baby, go, Joe thought. The arm is working. He quickly derailed the conversation.
Another thing that bothers me. Why don't we ever challenge the spherical Earth theory? Huh? Look,
Joe said,
if all the scientists and eggheads and commies and liberals are pushing it into our schools all the time, there must be something a little fishy about it. You ever stop to think that there's no way, just no way at all, to reconcile a spherical Earth with the story of the flood, or Joshua's miracle, or Jesus standing on the pinnacle at the temple and seeing all the kingdoms of the earth? Then I ask you, man to man, in all your travels, have you ever seen the curvature anywhere? Every place I've been is flat. Are we going to trust the Bible and the evidence of our senses, or are we going to listen to a bunch of agnostics and atheists in laboratory smocks? But the Earth's shadow on the moon during an eclipse...
Joe took a dime out of his pocket and held it up.
This casts a circular shadow, but it's flat, not spherical.
Kotek stared into space for a long moment, while Joe waited with suppressed excitement.
You know something?
Kotek said finally.
All the Bible miracles and our own travels and the shadow on the moon would make sense if the Earth was shaped like a carrot and all the continents were on the flat end.
Praise be to Simon's God, Bugs Bunny, Joe thought elatedly. It's happening. He's not only gullible, he's creative. I followed the cop, the pig, I corrected myself, out of the cafeteria. I was so keyed up that it was a trip. The blue of his uniform, the neon signs, even the green of the lampposts, all were coming and super bright. That was adrenaline. My mouth was dry, dehydration, all the classic flight-fight symptoms. The activation syndrome, Skinner calls it. I let the cop, the pig, get half a block ahead and reached in my pocket for the revolver.
Come on, George,
Malik shouted. George didn't want to move. His heart was thumping, his arms and legs trembling so hard he knew they'd be useless to him in a fight. But he just didn't want to move. He'd had enough of running from these motherfuckers. But he couldn't help himself. As the men in blue shirts and white helmets came on, the crowd surged away from them, and George had to move back with the crowd or be knocked down and trampled.
Come on, George.
It was Pete Jackson at his side now, with a good, hard grip on his arm, tugging him.
God damn it, why do we have to run away from them?
George said, stumbling backward. Peter was smiling faintly.
Don't you read your Mao, George? Enemy attacks. We retreat. Let the Morituri fanatics stand and get creamed.
I couldn't do it. My hand held the gun, but I couldn't take it out and hold it in front of me any more than I could take out my penis and wave it around. I was sure, even though the street was empty except for me and the pig, that a dozen people would jump out of doorways yelling, "Look, he took it out of his pants!" Just like right now when Hagbard said,
"Button up your asshole. We're in for a fight."
I stood frozen like I stood frozen on the embankment above the Passaic.
Are you on an ego trip playing at being a revolutionary?
Carlo asked. And Mavis?
All the militant radicals in your crowd ever do is take out the Molotov cocktail diagram that they carefully clipped from the New York Review of Books, hang it on the bathroom door, and jack off in connection with it.
Howard sang.
The foe is attacking, their ships coming near. Now is the time to fight without fear. Now is the time to look death in the eye. Before we submit, we'll fight till we die.
This time, I got the gun out of my pocket, standing there looking down at the Passaic, and I raised it to my forehead. If I didn't have the courage for homicide, Jesus knows I have to spare enough for 100 suicides. And I only have to do it once, just once, and then oblivion. I cocked the firing pin. More play acting, George, or will you really do it? I'll do it. Damn you, damn all of you. I pull the trigger and fall with the explosion into blackness. AUM, was a product of the scientists at ELF, the Eurasian Liberation Front, and shared by them with the jams. An extract of hemp, boosted with RNA, the learning molecule. It also had small traces of the famous Frisco speedball, heroin, cocaine and LSD. The effect seemed to be that the heroin stilled anxiety, the RNA stimulated creativity, the hemp and acid opened the mind to joy, and the cocaine was there to fit the law of fives. The delicate balance created no hallucinations, no sense of high, just a sudden spurt in what Hagbard Chalene liked to call constructive gullibility. It was one of those sudden shifts of movement that occur in a mob scene. Instead of pushing George and Peter back, the crowd between them and the white helmets were parting. A slender man fell heavily against George, anguish in his eyes. There was a terrible thump, and the man fell to the ground. George saw the dark brown wooden cross before he saw the man who wielded it. There was blood and hair at the end of the cross arm. The God's Lightning Man was dark, broad and muscular, with a blue shadow on his cheeks. He looked Italian or Spanish. He looked, in fact, a lot like Carlo. His eyes were wide and his mouth was open and he was breathing heavily. The expression was neither rage nor sadistic joy, just the unthinking, panting alertness of a man doing a difficult and fatiguing job. He bent over the fallen, slender man and raised the cross.
"All right,"
snapped Peter Jackson. He pushed George aside. There was a silly-looking yellow plastic water pistol in his hand. He squirted the oblivious God's Lightning Man in the back of the neck. The man screamed, arched backward, the cross flying, end over end, into the air. He fell on his back and lay screaming and writhing.
"Come on now, motherfucker."
Pete snarled as he dragged George into the crowd. Broken field running toward 42nd Street.
"An hour and a half to go,"
Hagbard says, finally beginning to show suppressed tension. George checks his watch. It's exactly 10:30 p.m. Ingolstadt time. The plastic canoe is wailing, "Krishna, Krishna, Hari, Hari." Under the noon sun, 2 days earlier, Carmel speeds in his jeep away from Las Vegas.
"Who am I going to meet at the Norton Cabal?"
Joe asks.
"Judge Crater? Amelia Earhart? Nothing would surprise me now." "A few real together people,"
Simon replies.
"but no one like that. But you'll have to die, really die, man, before you're illuminated."
He smiles gently.
"Aside from death and destruction, you won't find anything you'd call supernatural with this bunch, not even a whiff of old Chicago-style Satanism." "God,"
Joe says.
"was that only a week ago?" "Yep."
Simon grins, gunning his VW around a Chevrolet with Oregon license plates.
"It's still 1969, even if you seem to have lived several years since we met at the Anarchist Caucus."
His eyes are amused as he half turns to glance at Joe.
"I suppose that means you know what's been happening in my dreams. I'm getting the flash forwards already." "Always happens after a good, dirty black mass with pot mixed in the incense,"
Simon says.
"What sort of thing you getting? Is it happening when you're awake yet?" "No, only in my dreams."
Joe pauses, thinking.
"I only know it's the real article because the dreams are so vivid. One set has to do with some kind of pro-censorship rally at the Sheraton Chicago Hotel, I think, about a year from now. There's another set that seems farther in the future, 5 or 6 years, where I'm impersonating a doctor for some reason, and a third group of images comes to me now and then that seems to be the set of a Frankenstein movie, except that the extras are all hippies and there seems to be a rock festival going on. Does it bother you?" "A little. I'm used to waking up in the morning with the future ahead of me, not behind me, and ahead of me both." "You'll get used to it. You're just beginning to contact what old Weishaupt called die Morgens heute gestern Welt, the tomorrow, today, yesterday world. It gave Goethe the idea for Faust, just like Weishaupt's Ewige Blumenkraft slogan inspired Goethe's Ewige Weibliche. I tell you what,"
Simon suggested.
"you might try wearing 3 wristwatches like Bucky Fuller does. One showing the time where you're at, one showing the time where you're going, and one showing the time at some arbitrary place like Greenwich Mean Time or your hometown. It'll help you get used to relativity. Meanwhile, never whistle while you're pissing. And you might repeat to yourself when you get disorientated, Fuller's sentence, I seem to be a verb.
They drove in silence for a while, and Joe pondered on being a verb. Hell, he thought, I have enough trouble understanding what Fuller means when he says God is a verb. Simon let him mull it over, and began humming again.
Ramesses II is dead, my love. He's walking the fields where the blessed live.
Joe realized he was starting to doze. And all the faces at the luncheon table looked at him in astonishment.
No, seriously,
he said.
Anthropologists are too timid to say it out in the open in public, but corner one of them in private and ask him.
Every detail was clear. It was the same room in the Sheraton Chicago Hotel, and the faces were the same. I've been here before, and said this before.
The rain dances of the Indians work. The rain always comes. So why isn't it possible that their gods are real and ours isn't? Have you ever prayed to Jesus for something and really gotten it?
There's a long silence, and finally an old tight-faced woman smiles youthfully and declares,
Young man, I'm going to try it. How do I meet an Indian in Chicago?
Like tomahawks, the crosses of God's lightning rose and fell on the slender man's defenceless skull. They'd found their injured comrade lying on the street, twisting and moaning beside his erstwhile victim. A couple of them hauled the wounded God's lightning man away, while the rest took their revenge on the unconscious peace demonstrator.
You, Luke,
says Yeshua ben Yosef.
Don't write that down.
Space-time, then, may be slanted or kiltered when you're lost out here. Fernando Poo looks through his glass at a new island, not guessing that it will be named after himself, not imagining that someday Simon Moon will write,
In 1472, Fernando Poo discovered Fernando Poo.
And Hagbard says,
Truth is a tiger.
While Timothy Leary does a Crown Point Pavan out of San Luis Obispo jail, and 4 million years earlier, one squink says to another,
I've solved the ecology problem on this new planet.
The other squink, partner to the first, they own Swift Kick Inc., the shoddiest contractors in the Milky Way, says,
How?
The first squink laughs coarsely.
Every organism produced will be programmed with a death trip. It'll give them a rather gloomy outlook, I admit, especially the more conscious ones, but it will sure minimize costs for us.
Swift Kick Inc. cut the edges every other way they could think, and Earth emerged as the horrible example invoked in all classes on planetary design throughout the galaxy.
When Burroughs told me that, I flipped, because I was 23 that year and lived on Clark Street. Besides, I immediately saw the application to the law of fives. 2 + 3 = 5, and Clark has 5 letters. I was mulling this over when I happened to notice the shipwreck in Pound's Canto 23. That's the only shipwreck mentioned in the whole 800-page poem, in spite of all the nautical voyages described. Canto 23 also contains the line, with the sun in a golden cup, which Yeats says inspired his own lines, the golden apples of the sun, the silver apples of the moon. Golden apples, of course, brought me back to Eris, and I realized I was on to something hot. Then I tried adding the Illuminati 5 to 23, and I got 28, the average menstrual period of woman, the lunar cycle. Back to the silver apples of the moon, and I'm Moon. Of course, Pound and Yeats both have 5 letters in their names. If this be schizophrenia, I said, with a P. Henry twist, much better than an O. Henry twist, make the most of it. I looked deeper.
Through a bullhorn, a police captain began to shout,
Clear the plaza! Clear the plaza!
The first reports of the annihilation camps were passed on to the OSS by a Swiss businessman, evaluated as being one of the most trustworthy informants on affairs in Nazi Europe. The State Department decided that the stories were not confirmed. That was early in 1943. By autumn of that year, more urgent reports from the same source, transmitted still through the OSS, forced a major policy conference. It was again decided that the reports were not true. As winter began, the English government asked for another conference to discuss similar reports from their own intelligence networks and from the government of Romania. The delegates met in Bermuda for a warm, sunny weekend and decided that the reports were not true. They returned to their work, refreshed and tanned. The death trains continued to roll. Early in 1944, Henry Morgenthau, Jr., Secretary of the Treasury, was reached by dissenters in the State Department, examined the evidence, and forced a meeting with President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Shaken by the assertion in Morgenthau's document, Roosevelt pledged that he would act at once. He never did. It was said later that the State Department convinced him once again of their own analysis. The reports simply were not true. When Mr. Hitler said Vernichtung, he had not really meant Vernichtung. An author, Ben Hecht, then placed an ad in the New York Times, presenting the evidence to the public. A group of prominent rabbis attacked him for alarming Jews unnecessarily and undermining confidence in America's chief executive during wartime. Finally, late that year, American and Russian troops began liberating the camps, and General Eisenhower insisted that news photographers take detailed movies, which were released to the whole world. In the interval between the first suppressed report by the Swiss businessman and the liberation of the first camp, 6 million people had died.
That's what we call a Bavarian fire drill,
Simon explained to Joe. It was another time. He was driving another Volkswagen. In fact, it was the night of April the 23rd, and they were going to meet Tobias Knight at the UN building.
It was one official named Winifred who'd been transferred from the Justice Department to a key State Department desk where every bit of evidence passed for evaluation. But the same principles apply everywhere. For instance, we're half an hour early for the meeting anyhow. I'll give you an illustration right now.
They were approaching the corner of 43rd Street and 3rd Avenue, and Simon had observed that the street light was changing to red. As he stopped the car, he opened the door and said to Joe,
"Follow me."
Puzzled, Joe got out as Simon ran to the car behind them, beat on the hood with his hand and shouted,
"Bavarian fire drill! Out!"
He made vigorous but ambiguous motions with his hands and ran to the car next back. Joe saw the first subject look dubiously at his companion and then open the door and get out, obediently trailing behind Simon's urgent and sombre figure.
"Bavarian fire drill! Out!"
Simon was already shouting at the third car back. As Joe trotted along, occasionally adding his own voice to persuade the more dubious drivers, every car gradually emptied and people formed a neat line heading back toward Lexington Avenue. Simon then ducked between two cars and began jogging toward the front of the line at 3rd Avenue again, shouting to everybody,
"Complete circle, stay in line."
Obediently, everyone followed in a great circle back to their own cars, re-entering from the side opposite to that from which they had left. Simon and Joe climbed back into the VW, the light changed, and they sped ahead.
"You see?"
Simon asked.
"Use words they've been conditioned to since childhood, fire drill, stay in line, like that, and never look back to see if they're obeying. They'll follow." Well, that's the way the Illuminati guaranteed that the final solution wouldn't be interrupted. Winifred, one guy who had been around long enough to have an impressive title, and his scrawl, "Evaluation Dubious," on the bottom of each memo. And 6 million died. Hilarious, isn't it?
And Joe remembered from the little book by Hagbard, Never Whistle While You're Pissing, privately printed and distributed only to members of the Jams and the Legion of Dynamic Discord. The individual act of obedience is the cornerstone not only of the strength of authoritarian society, but also of its weakness. On November the 23rd, 1970, the body of Stanislaus Idipuski, 46, of West Living Park Road, was found floating in the Chicago River. Death, according to the police laboratory, did not result from drowning, but from beating about the head and shoulders with a square-ended object. The first inquiries by homicide detectives revealed that Idipuski had been a member of God's Lightning, and the theory was formed that a conflict between the dead man and his former colleagues might have resulted in his being snuffed with their wooden crosses. Further investigation revealed that Idipuski had been a construction worker, and until very recently well liked on his job, behaving in a normal, down-to-earth manner, bitching about the government, cursing the lazy bums on welfare, hating niggers, shouting obscene remarks at good-looking dolls who passed construction sites, and, when the odds were safely above the 8-to-1 level, joining other middle-aged workers in attacking and beating young men with long hair, piece buttons, or other un-American stigmata. Then about a month before, all that had changed. He began bitching about the bosses as well as the government, almost sounding like a communist at times. When somebody else cussed the crumb bums on welfare, Stan remarked thoughtfully,
"Well, you know, our union keeps them from getting jobs, fellas, so what else can they do but go on welfare? Steal?"
He even said once, when some of the guys were good-humouredly giving the finger and making other gallant noises and signals towards a passing 18-year-old girl,
"Hey, you know, that might really be embarrassing and scaring her."
Worse yet, his own hair began to grow surprisingly long in the back, and his wife told friends that he didn't look at TV much anymore, but instead sat in a chair most evenings, reading books. The police found that was indeed true, and his small library, gathered in less than a month, was remarkable indeed, featuring works on astronomy, sociology, Oriental mysticism, Darwin's Origin of the Species, detective novels by Raymond Chandler, Alice in Wonderland, and a college-level text on number theory, with a section on primes heavily marked with notes in the margin. The gallant and now pathetic tracks of a mind that was beginning to grow after 4 decades of stagnation, and then had been abruptly stomped. Most mysterious of all was the card found in the dead man's pocket, which, although waterlogged, could still be read. One side said, "There is no enemy anywhere." On the other side, even more mysteriously, was inscribed with various symbols. The police might have tried to decipher this, but then they discovered that Idipuski had resigned from God's Lightning, giving his fellow members a lecture on tolerance in the process the night before his death. That closed the case, definitely. Homicide did not investigate murders clearly connected with God's Lightning, since the Red Squad had its own personal accommodation with the burgeoning organisation.
"Poor motherfucker,"
a detective said, looking at Idipuski's photographs, and closed the file forever. Nobody ever reopened it, or traced the change in the dead man back to his attendance at the meeting 1 month before of KCUF at the Sheraton, Chicago, where the punch was spiked with AUM.
In the act of conception, of course, the father contributes 23 chromosomes and the mother contributes another 23. In the I Ching hexagram, 23 has connotations of sinking or breaking apart, shades of the unfortunate Captain Clark's. Another woman just came by, collecting for the Mother's March Against Muscular Dystrophy. I gave her a quarter. Where was I? Oh, yes. James Joyce had 5 letters in both his front name and his hind name, so he was worth looking into. A portrait of the artist has 5 chapters, all well and good, but Ulysses has 18 chapters, a stumper until I remembered that 5 plus 18 equals 23. How about Finnegan's Wake? Alas, that has 17 chapters, and I was bogged down for a while. Trying another angle, I wondered if Frank Sullivan, the poor cluck who got shot instead of John at the Biograph Theater that night,
could have lingered until after midnight, dying on July 23rd instead of July 22nd, as usually stated. I looked it up in Toland's book, The Dillinger Days. Poor Frank said to say died before midnight, but Toland included an interesting detail, which I told you that night at the seminary bar. 23 people died of heat prostration that day in Chicago. He added something else. 17 people had died of heat prostration the day before. Why did he mention that? I'm sure he doesn't know. But there it was again, 23 and 17. Maybe something important is going to happen in the year 2317. I couldn't check that, of course. You can't navigate precisely in the Morgens heutige Sternwelt. So I went back to 1723 and struck golden apples. That was the year Adam Smith and Adam Weishaupt were both born, and Smith published The Wealth of Nations the same year Weishaupt revived the Illuminati, 1776. Well, 2 plus 3 equals 5, fitting the law of fives, but 1 plus 7 equals 8, fitting nothing. Where did that leave me? 8, I reflected, is the number of letters in Callisti. Back to the golden apple again. And 8 is also 2 to the power of 3. Hot damn! Naturally, it came as no surprise when the 8 defendants in the Chicago conspiracy trial, which grew out of our little convention week carnival, were tried on the 23rd floor of the federal building amid a flurry of synchronicity. A Hoffman among the defendants, a Hoffman as judge, the Illuminati Pyramid, or Great Seal of the U.S., right inside the door of the building, and a scale getting worse abuse than the other defendants. 5-letter names, and proliferating. Abby, Davis, Foran, Scale, Jerry Rubin, twice, and the clincher, Clark, Ramsey, not Captain, who was torpedoed and sunk by the judge before he could testify. I got interested in Dutch Schultz because he died on October 23rd. A cluster of synchronicity, that man. He ordered the shooting of Vincent Mad Dog Carl. Remember Mad Dog, Texas? Carl was shot on 23rd Street when he was 23 years old, and Charlie Workman, who allegedly shot Schultz, served 23 years in prison for it, although rumor has it that Mendy Weiss, 2 5-letter names again, did the real shooting. Does 17 come in? You bet. Schultz was first sentenced to prison at the age of 17. Around this time, I brought Robert Heinlein's The Puppet Masters, thinking the plot might parallel some Illuminati operations. Imagine how I felt when Chapter 2 began 23 hours and 17 minutes ago. A flying saucer landed in Iowa.
And in New York, Peter Jackson is trying to get the next issue of Confrontation out on time. Although the office is still a shambles, the editor and star researcher have disappeared, the best reporter has gone ape and claims to be at the bottom of the Atlantic with a wax tycoon. And the police are hounding Peter to find out why the first 2 detectives assigned to the case can't be located. Sitting in his apartment, now the magazine's office, in his shirt and shorts, Peter dials his phone with one hand, adding another crushed cigarette to the pile in the ashtray with the other. Throwing a manuscript into a basket marked "Ready for Printer," he crosses off "Lead Article." The youngest student ever admitted to Columbia tells why he dropped out by L.L. Durruti from a list on the pad before him. His pencil moves down to the bottom, "Book Review," as he listens to the phone ring. Finally, he hears the click of a lifted receiver, and a rich, fluty voice says,
"Epicene Wildblood here? Got your book review ready, Epi? Have it tomorrow, dear boy. Can't be any faster, honestly." "Tomorrow will do,"
Peter says, writing, "Call again, AM, next to book review."
"It's a dreadfully long monster of a book,"
Wildblood says pettishly,
"and I certainly won't have time to read it, but I'm giving it a thorough skimming. The authors are utterly incompetent, no sense of style or structure at all. It starts out as a detective story, switches to science fiction, then goes off into supernatural, and is full of the most detailed information of dozens of ghastly, boring subjects. And the time sequence is all out of order in a very pretentious imitation of Faulkner and Joyce. Worse yet, it has the most raunchy sex scenes thrown in just to make it sell, I'm sure. And the authors, whom I've never heard of, have the supreme bad taste to introduce real political figures into this mishmash and pretend to be exposing a real conspiracy. You can be sure I won't waste time reading such rubbish, but I'll have a perfectly devastating review ready for you by tomorrow noon.
Well, we don't expect you to read every book you review,
Peter says mollifyingly.
Just so long as you can be entertaining about them. The Foot Fetishist Liberation Front will be participating in the rally at the UN building,
J. Malik said, as George and Peter and he were affixing their black armbands.
Christ,
Jackson said disgustedly.
We can't afford to take that attitude.
Jay said severely.
The only hope for the left at this time is coalition politics. We can't exclude anybody who wants to join us. I've got nothing against faggots personally.
Peter begins.
Gays.
Jay says patiently.
I've got nothing against gays personally.
Peter goes on.
But they are a bring-down at rallies. They just give God's lightning more evidence to say we're all a bunch of fruits. But okay, realism is realism. There are a lot of them, and they swell our ranks and all that. But Jesus, Joe, these toe freaks are a splinter within a splinter. They're microscopic. Don't call them toe freaks,
Joe says.
They don't like that. A woman from the Mothers' March Against Psoriasis just came by with another collection box. I gave her a quarter, too. The marching mothers are going to strip Moon of his bread if this keeps up. Where was I? I meant to add, in relation to the Dutch Schultz shooting, that Marty Crampier, who ran the policy racket in Harlem, was also shot on October 23, 1935. The police asked him if there was a connection with the phlegmatic Flegenheimer's demise, and he said, "It's got to be one of them coincidences." I wonder how he emphasized that. One of them coincidences, or one of them coincidences? How much did he know? That brings me to the 40 enigma. As I pointed out, 1 plus 7 equals 8, the number of letters in Callisti. 8 times 5 equals 40. More interestingly, without invoking the mystic 5, we still arrive at 40 by adding 17 plus 23. What, then, is the significance of 40? I've run through various associations. Jesus had his 40 days in the desert, Ali Baba and his 40 thieves, Buddhists have their 40 meditations, the solar system is almost exactly 40 astronomical units in radius, Pluto yo-yos a bit, but I have no definite theory yet.
The colour television set in the Three Lions pub in the Tudor Hotel at 42nd Street and 2nd Avenue shows the white helmeted men carrying wooden crosses fall back as the blue helmeted men carrying billy clubs move forward. The CBS camera pans over the plaza. There are 5 bodies on the ground, scattered like flotsam tossed on a beach by a receding wave. 4 of them are moving, making slow efforts to get up. The 5th is not moving at all. George said,
I think that's the guy we saw getting clubbed. My God, I hope he isn't dead.
Joe Malik said,
If he is dead, he may get people to demand that something be done about God's lightning.
Peter Jackson laughed mirthlessly.
You still think some hunky peacenik getting killed is going to make people indignant? Don't you understand? Nobody in this country cares what happens to a peace freak. You're in the same boat with the niggers now, you silly sons of bitches.
Carlos looked up in astonishment as I burst into the room, still wet from the Passaic, and threw the gun at his feet, screaming,
You silly sons of bitches, you can't even make bombs without blowing yourselves up. And when you buy a gun, the motherfucker is defective and misfires. You can't expel me. I quit, you silly sons of bitches. You silly sons of bitches,
Simon shouted. Joe woke as the VW swerved amid a flurry of Hell's Angels' bikes roaring by. He was back in real time again. But the word had quotes round it in his mind now, and it always would.
Wow,
he said.
I was in Chicago again, and then at that rock festival, and then I was in somebody else's lifeline. Goddamn Harley Davidsons.
Simon mutters as the last angel thunders by.
When 50 or 60 of them swarm by like that, it's as bad as trying to drive on the sidewalk in Times Square at high noon without hitting a pedestrian. Later for that,
Joe said, conscious of his growing ease in using Simon's own language.
This tomorrow, today, yesterday time is beginning to get under my skin. It's happening more and more often.
Simon sighed.
You want words to put around it. You can't accept it unless it has labels dangling off it, like a new suit. Okay. And your favorite word game is science. Fine. Right on. Tomorrow we'll drop by the main library and you can look up the English science journal Nature for Summer, 1966. There's an article in there by the University College physicist F.R. Stannard about what he calls the Faustian universe. He tells how the behavior of K-mesons can't be explained assuming a one-way time track, but fits into a neat pattern if you assume our universe overlaps another where time runs in the opposite direction. He calls it the Faustian universe. But I'll bet he has no idea that Goethe wrote Faust after experiencing that universe directly, just as you're doing lately. Incidentally, Stannard points out that everything in physics is symmetrical, except our present concept of one-way time. Once you admit two-way time traffic, you've got a completely symmetrical universe. Fits the Occamite's demand for simplicity. Stannard will give you lots of words, man. Meanwhile, just settle for what Abdul al-Hazred wrote in the Necronomicon. Past, present, future. All are one in Yog-Sothoth, or what Weishaupt wrote in his Königen, Kirchen und Dummheit. There is but one eye, and it is all eyes. One mind, it is all minds. One time, and it is now. Grok?
Joe nods dubiously, faintly hearing the music. Rama, 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 Hare.
2 big rhinoceroses, 3 big rhinoceroses.
Dillinger made contact with the mind of Richard Belts, 43-year-old professor of physics at Queen's College, as Belts was being loaded into an ambulance to be taken to Bellevue Hospital, where X-rays would reveal severe skull fractures. Shit, Dillinger thought. Why does somebody have to be half dead before I can reach him? Then he concentrated on his message. 2 universes flowing in opposite directions. 2 together form a third entity which is synergetically more than the sum of its 2 parts. Thus 2 always leads to 3. 2 and 3. Duality and trinity. Every unity is a duality and a trinity, a pentagon, sheer energy, no matter involved. From the pentagon depends 5 more pentagons, like the petals of a flower, a white rose, 5 petals and a centre, 6, 2 times 3. The flower interlocks with another flower just like it, forming a polyhedron made of pentagons. Each such polyhedron could have common surfaces with other polyhedrons, forming infinite lattice work based on the pentagonal unit. They would be immortal, self-sustaining, not computers, beyond computers, gods, all space for their habitation, infinitely complex. The howl of a siren reached the unconscious ears of Professor Belts. Consciousness is present in the living body, even in one that is apparently unconscious. Unconsciousness is not the absence of consciousness, but its temporary immobility. It is not a state resembling death. It is not like death at all. Once the necessary complexity of brain cell interconnections is reached, substantial energy relationships are set up. These can exist independently of the material base that brought them into being. All of this, of course, is merely visual structural metaphor for interactions on the energy level that cannot be visualized. The siren howled. In the 3 Lions pub, George said to Peter,
What was in that water pistol?
Sulfuric acid.
Acid is just the first stage,
said Simon.
Like matter is the first stage of life and consciousness. acid launches you. But once you're out there, if the mission is successful, you jettison the first stage and you're traveling free of gravity, which means free of matter. Acid dissolves the barriers which prevent the maximum possible complexity of energy relationships from building up in the brain. At Norton Cabal, we show you how to pilot the second stage.
Waving their crosses over their heads and howling incoherently, the men of God's lightning formed wavering ranks and marched around the territory they had conquered. Zev Hirsch and Frank Otchuk carried the banner that read, "Love it or we'll stomp you." Howard sang.
The tribes of the porpoise are fearless and strong. Our land is the ocean, our banner's a song. Our weapon is speed, and our nose is like rock. No foe can withstand our terrible shock.
A cloud of porpoise bodies swam out from somewhere behind Hagbard's submarine. Through the pale blue-green medium which Hagbard's TV cameras made out of water, they seemed to fly toward the distant spider-like ships of the Illuminati.
"What's happening?"
said George.
"Where's Howard?" "Howard is leading them,"
said Hagbard. He flipped a toggle on the railing of the balcony on which they stood in the centre of a globe that looked like a bubble of air at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean.
"War room, get missiles ready. We may have to back up the Porpoise Attack." "The Tovarish Chelin,"
came a voice. The porpoises were too far away to be seen now. George discovered that he was not afraid. The whole thing was too much like watching a science fiction movie. There was too much illusion involved in this submarine of Hagbard's. If he were able to realize in his glands and nerves that he was in a vulnerable metal ship thousands of feet below the surface of the Atlantic, under such enormous pressure that the slightest stress could crack the hull and send water bursting in that would crush them to death, then he might be afraid. If he were really able to accept the fact that those little distant globes with waving legs appended to them were undersea craft manned by people who intended to destroy the vessel he was in, then he could be afraid. Actually, if he could not see as much as he was seeing, but only feel and sense things and be told what was happening, as in the average airplane flight, then he would be afraid. As it was, the 120,000-year-old city of Paos looked like a tabletop model. And though he might intellectually accept Hagbard's statement that they were over the lost continent of Atlantis, in his bones he didn't believe in Atlantis. As a result, he didn't believe in any of the rest of this either. Suddenly Howard was outside their bubble, or some other porpoise. That was another thing that made this hard to accept. Talking porpoises.
"Ready for destruction of enemy ships,"
said Howard. Hagbard shook his head.
"I wish we could communicate with them. I wish I could give them a chance to surrender, but they wouldn't listen. And they have communication systems on their ships that I can't get through to."
He turned to George.
"They use a type of insulated telepathy to communicate, the very thing that tipped off Sheriff Jim Cartwright that you were in a hotel room in Mad Dog smoking Weishaupt's Wonderweed."
"You don't want them too close when they go,"
said Howard.
"Are you people out of the way?"
said Hagbard.
5 big rhinoceroses, 6 big rhinoceroses.
"Of course. Quit this hesitating. This is no time to be a humanitarian."
"The sea is crueler than the land,"
said Hagbard.
"Sometimes."
"The sea is cleaner than the land,"
said Howard.
"There's no hate, just death when and as needed. These people have been your enemies for 20,000 years.
"I'm not that old,"
said Hagbard.
"and I have very few enemies."
"If you wait any longer, you'll endanger the submarine and my people."
George looked out at the red and white striped globes which were moving toward them through the blue-green water. They were much larger now and closer. Whatever was propelling them wasn't visible. Hagbard reached out a brown finger, let it rest on a white button on the railing in front of him, then pressed it decisively. There was a bright flash of light, dimmed slightly by the medium through which it travelled, on the surface of each of the globes. It was like watching fireworks through tinted glasses. Next, the globes crumbled as if they were ping-pong balls being struck by invisible sledgehammers.
"That's all there is to it,"
said Hagbard quietly. The air round George seemed to vibrate, and the floor under him shook. Suddenly he was terrified. Feeling the shockwave from the simultaneous explosions out there in the water made it real. A relatively thin metal shell was all that protected him from total annihilation, and nobody would ever hear from him or know what had happened to him. Large, glittering objects drifted down through the water from one of the nearby Illuminati spider ships. They vanished among the streets of the city that George now knew was real. The buildings in the area near the explosion of the Illuminati ships looked more ruined than they had before. The ocean bottom was churned up in brown clouds. Down into the brown clouds drifted the crushed spider ships. George looked for the Temple of Tethys. It stood intact in the distance.
"Did you see those statues fall out of the lead ship?"
said Hagbard.
"I'm claiming them."
He hit the switch on the railing.
"Prepare for salvage operation."
They dropped down among buildings deeply buried in sediment, and at the bottom of their television globe George saw two huge claws reach out, seemingly from nowhere, actually I guess from the underside of the submarine, and pick up 4 gleaming gold statues that lay half buried in the mud. Suddenly a bell rang, and a red flash lit up the interior of the bubble.
"We're under attack again,"
said Hagbard. Oh no, George thought. Not when I'm starting to believe that all this is real. I won't be able to stand it. Here goes Dawn doing his world-famous coward act again. Hagbard pointed. A white globe hovered like an underwater moon above a distant range of mountains. On its pale surface a red emblem was painted, a glaring eye inside a triangle.
"Give me missile visibility,"
said Hagbard, flicking a switch. Between the white globe and the Leif Erikson, 4 orange lights appeared in the water, rushing toward them.
"It just doesn't pay to underestimate them, ever,"
said Hagbard.
"First, it turns out they can detect me when they shouldn't have equipment good enough to do that. Now I find that not only do they have small craft in the vicinity, they've got the Zvak herself coming after me. And the Zvak is firing underwater missiles at me, though I'm supposed to be indetectable. I think we might be in trouble, George."
George wanted to close his eyes, but he also didn't want to show fear in front of Hagbard. He wondered what death at the bottom of the Atlantic would feel like. Probably something like being under a pile driver. The water would hit them, engulf them, and it wouldn't be like any ordinary water. It would be like liquid steel, every drop striking with the force of a 10-ton truck, prying cell apart from cell and crushing each cell individually, reducing the body to a protoplasmic dish rag. He remembered reading about the disappearance of an atomic submarine called the Thresher back in the 60s, and he recalled that the New York Times had speculated that death by drowning in water under extreme pressure would be exceedingly painful, though brief. Every nerve individually being crushed, the spinal cord crushed everywhere along its length. The brain squeezed to death, bursting, rupturing, bleeding into the steel-hard water. The human form would doubtless be unrecognisable in minutes. George thought of every bug he had ever stepped on, and bugs made him think of the spider ships. That's what we did to them. And I define them as enemies only on Hagbard's say-so. Carlo was right. I can't kill. Hagbard hesitated, didn't he? Yes, but he did it. Any man who can cause a death like that to be visited upon other men is a monster. No, not a monster. Only too human, but not my kind of human. Shit, George. He's your kind of human, all right. You're just a coward. Cowardice doth make conscience for us all. Hagbard called out.
"Howard, where the hell are you?"
The torpedo shape appeared on the right side of the bubble.
Over here, Hagbard. We've got more mines ready. We can go after those missiles with mines like we did the spider ships. Think that'll work?
It's dangerous,
said Hagbard,
because the missiles might explode on contact with the metal and electronic equipment in the mines.
We're willing to try,
said Howard, and without another word, he swam away.
Wait a minute,
Hagbard said.
I don't like this. There's too much danger to the porpoises.
He turned to George and shook his head.
I'm not risking a goddamn thing. They stand to be blown to bits. It's not right. I'm not that important.
You are risking something,
said George, trying to control the quaver in his voice.
Those missiles will destroy us if the dolphins don't stop them.
At that moment, there were 4 blinding flashes where the orange lights had been. George gripped the railing, sensing that the shock wave of these explosions would be worse than that caused by the destruction of the spider ships. It came. George had been readying himself for it, but unable to tell when it would come, and it still took him by surprise. Everything shook violently. Then the bottom dropped out of his stomach, as if the submarine had suddenly leapt up. George grabbed the railing with both arms and clinged to it as the only solid thing near him.
Oh, God, we're going to be killed,
he cried.
They got the missiles,
Hagbard said.
That gives us a fighting chance. Laser crew, attempt to puncture the Zwack. Fire at will.
Howard reappeared outside the bubble.
How did your people do?
Hagbard asked him.
All 4 of them were killed,
said Howard.
The missiles exploded when they approached them, just as you predicted.
George, who was standing up straight now, thankful that Hagbard had simply ignored his episode of terror, said,
They were killed saving our lives. I'm sorry it happened, Howard.
Laser beam firing, Hagbard,
a voice announced. There was a pause.
I think we hit them.
You needn't be sorry,
said Howard.
We neither look forward to death in fear, nor back upon it in sorrow, especially when someone has died doing something worthwhile. Death is the end of one illusion and the beginning of another.
What other illusion?
Asked George.
When you're dead, right?
Energy can neither be created nor destroyed,
said Hagbard.
Death itself is an illusion.
These people were talking like some of the Zen students and acid mystics George had known. If I could feel that way, he thought, I wouldn't be such a goddamn coward. Howard and Hagbard must be enlightened. I've got to become enlightened. I can't stand living this way anymore. Whatever it took, acid alone wasn't the answer. George had tried acid already, and he knew that while the experience might be wholly remarkable, for him it left little residue in terms of changed attitudes or behaviour. Of course, if you thought your attitudes and behaviour should change, you mimicked other acid heads.
I'll try to find out what's happening to the Zwack,
said Howard, and swam away.
The porpoises do not fear death. They do not avoid suffering. They are not assailed by conflict between intellect and feeling, and they are not worried about being ignorant of things. In other words, they have not decided that they know the difference between good and evil, and in consequence, they do not consider themselves sinners. Understand?
Very few humans consider themselves sinners nowadays,
said George.
But everyone is afraid of death.
All human beings consider themselves sinners. It's just about the deepest, oldest, and most universal human hang-up there is. In fact, it's almost impossible to speak of it in terms that don't confirm it. To say that human beings have a universal hang-up, as I just did, is to restate the belief that all men are sinners in different languages. In that sense, the book of Genesis, which was written by early Semitic opponents of the Illuminati, is quite right. To arrive at a cultural turning point where you decide that all human conduct can be classified in one of 2 categories, good and evil, is what creates all sin, plus anxiety, hatred, guilt, depression, all the peculiarly human emotions. And of course, such a classification is the very antithesis of creativity. To the creative mind, there is no right or wrong. Every action is an experiment, and every experiment yields its fruit in knowledge. To the moralist, every action can be judged as right or wrong, and, mind you, in advance, without knowing what its consequences are going to be, depending on the mental disposition of the actor.
Thus, the men who burned Giordano Bruno at the stake knew they were doing good, even though the consequence of their actions was to deprive the world of a great scientist. If you can never be sure whether what you are doing is good or bad,
St. George,
aren't you liable to be pretty Hamlet-like?
He was feeling much better now, much less afraid, even though the enemy was still presumably out there trying to kill him. Maybe he was getting Darshan from Hagbard.
What's so bad about being Hamlet-like?
Said Hagbard.
Anyway, the answer is no, because you only become hesitant when you believe there is such a thing as good and evil, and that your action may be one or the other, and you're not sure which. That was the whole point about Hamlet. If you remember the play, it was his conscience that made him indecisive. So he should have murdered a whole lot of people in the first act?
Hagbard laughed.
Not necessarily. He might have decisively killed his uncle at the earliest opportunity, thus saving the lives of everyone else. Or he might have said, "Hey, am I really obligated to avenge my father's death?" and done nothing. He was due to succeed to the throne anyway, and if he'd just bided his time, everyone would have been a lot better off. There would have been no deaths, and the Norwegians would not have conquered the Danes as they did in the last scene of the last act. Though, being Norwegian myself, I would hardly begrudge Fortinbras his triumph.
At that moment, Howard appeared again outside their bubble.
The Zvak is retreating. Your laser beam punctured the outer shell, causing a leak in the fuel storage shells and putting excessive stress on the pressure-resisting system. They were forced to climb to higher levels, which put them so far away from you that they're now heading south, toward the tip of Africa.
Hagbard expelled a great sigh of relief.
That means they're heading for their home base. They'll enter a tunnel in the Persian Gulf, which will bring them into the great underground Sea of Volusia, which is deepest beneath the Himalayas. That was the first base they established. They were preparing it even before the fall of High Atlantis. It's devilishly well defended. One day, we'll penetrate it, though.
The thing that puzzled Joe most after his Illuminization was John Dillinger's penis. The rumours about the Smithsonian Institute, he knew, were true, even though any casual phone caller would get a flat denial from Institute officials. Certain high-placed government people could provide a dispensation, and the relic would be shown in the legendary alcohol bottle, all legendary 23 inches of it. But if John was alive, it wasn't his. And if it wasn't his, whose was it?
Frank Sullivan's,
Simon said when Joe finally asked him.
And who the hell was Frank Sullivan to have a tool like that?
But Simon only answered,
I don't know, just some guy who looked like John.
Atlantis also bothered Joe after he saw it the first time Hagbard took him for a ride in the Leif Erikson. It was all too pat, too plausible, too good to be true, especially the ruins of cities like Paos, with their architecture that obviously combined Egyptian and Mayan elements.
Science has been flying on instruments like a pilot in a fog ever since 1900,
he said, casually to Hagbard on the return trip to New York. This was in 72, according to his later recollections, fall of 72, almost 2 years after the test of AUM in Chicago.
You've been reading Bucky Fuller,
was Hagbard's cool reply.
Or was it Korzybski?
Never mind who I'm reading,
Joe said directly.
The thought in my head is that I never saw Atlantis any more than I ever saw Marilyn Monroe. I saw moving pictures which you told me were television reception of cameras outside your sub. And I saw moving pictures of what Hollywood assured me was a real woman, even though she looked more like a design by Petty or Vargas. In the Marilyn Monroe case, it's reasonable to believe what I'm told. I don't believe a robot that good has been built yet. But Atlantis... I know special effects men who could build a city like that on a tabletop and have dinosaurs walking through it, and your camera's trained on it.
You suspect me of trickery?
Hagbard asked, raising his eyebrows.
Trickery is your métier,
Joe said bluntly.
You're the Beethoven, the Rockefeller, the Michelangelo of deception, the Shakespeare of the gypsy switch, the two-headed nickel and the rabbit in the hat.
What little liver pills are to Carter, lies are to you. You dwell in a world of trapdoors, sliding panels, and Hindu rope tricks. Do I suspect you? Since I met you, I suspect everybody. Glad to hear it.
Hagbard grinned.
You're well on your way to paranoia. Take this card and keep it in your wallet. When you begin to understand it, you'll be ready for your next promotion. Just remember, it's not true unless it makes you laugh. That is the one and sole and infallible test of all ideas that will ever be presented to you.
And he handed Joe a card saying, "There is no friend anywhere."
Burroughs, incidentally, although he discovered the 23 synchronicity principle, is unaware of the correlation with 17. This makes it even more interesting that his date for the invasion of Earth by the Nova Mob in Nova Express is September 17, 1899. When I asked him how he picked that date, he said it just came to him out of the air. Damn. I was just interrupted by another woman collecting for the Mother's March against hernia. I only gave her a dime. W, the 23rd letter, keeps popping up in all this. Note, Weishaupt, Washington, William S. Burroughs, Charlie Workman, Mendy Weiss, Len Weinglass in the conspiracy trial, and others who will quickly come to mind. Even more interesting, the first physicist to apply the concept of synchronicity to physics after Jung published the theory was Wolfgang Pauli. Another suggestive letter number transformation, Adam Weishaupt, AW, is 1 to 23, and George Washington, GW, is 7 to 23. Spot the hidden 17 in there? But perhaps I grow too imaginative, even whimsical.
There was a click. George turned. All the time he'd been in the control centre with Hagbard, he had never looked back at the door through which he had come. He was surprised to see that it looked like an opening in thin air, or thin water. On either side of the doorway was blue-green water, and a dark horizon which was actually the ocean bottom. Then, in the centre, the doorway itself and a golden light silhouetting the figure of a beautiful woman. Mavis strode onto the balcony, pulling the door shut behind her. She was wearing forest green tights with white patent leather boots and a wide white belt. Her small but well-shaped breasts jiggled naturally under her blouse. George found himself thinking back to the scene on the beach. That was only this morning. And what time was it anyway? What time where? Back in Florida, it was probably 2 or 3 in the afternoon, which would make it 1 p.m. in Mad Dog, Texas. And probably about 6 out here in the Atlantic. Did time zones extend beneath the water? He supposed they did. On the other hand, if you were at the North Pole, you could skip around the pole and be in a different time zone every few seconds, and cross the international date line every few minutes if you wanted to, which would not, he reminded himself, make it possible to travel in time. But if he could go back to this morning and replay Mavis's demand for sex, this time he would respond. He now wanted her desperately. Well and good, but why did she say he was not a schmuck? Why did she imply admiration for him because he would not fuck her? If he had fucked her because she asked him and he felt he should, but without wanting to, he would have been a pure and simple schmuck. But he could have pronged her simply because she would have been nice to fuck, regardless of whether she would have admired him or despised him. But that was their game. Mavis's and Hagbard's game of saying, I do what I want to do, and I don't give a damn what you think. George cared a great deal about what other people thought, so not fucking Mavis at the time was at least honest, even if he was beginning to see some merit in the Discordian, he suppose it was Discordian, attitude of super self-sufficiency. Mavis smiled at him.
Well, George, had your baptism of fire?
George shrugged.
Well, that was the Mad Dog jail. And I've been in a few other bad scenes.
For instance, there was a time I held a pistol to my head and pulled the trigger. She'd sucked his cock, he'd watched her in manic masturbation, but he was desperate to get inside her, all the way up the womb, riding her ovarian trolley to the wonderful land of fuck, as Henry Miller said. What the hell was so special about Mavis's cunt? Especially after that induction ceremony scene. How Stella Maris seemed like a less neurotic woman, and was certainly a classic lay. After Stella Maris, who needed Mavis? A sudden question struck him. How did he know he'd laid Stella? It could have been Mavis inside that golden apple. It could have been some woman he'd never met. He was pretty sure it was a woman, unless it was a goat, a cow, or a sheep. Let's not put that kind of joke past Hagbard either. But even if it was a woman, why visualise Stella or Mavis, or somebody like them? It was probably some diseased old Etruscan whore that Hagbard kept around for religious purposes, some Sibyl, some what witch. Maybe it was Hagbard's rotten old Sicilian mother with no teeth, a black shawl, and 3 kinds of VD. No, it was Hagbard's father who was Sicilian. His mother was Norwegian.
What color were they?
He said suddenly to Hagbard.
Who? The Atlanteans. Oh,
Hagbard nodded.
They were covered with fur over most of their bodies like any normal ape. At least the High Atlanteans were. A mutation occurred around the time of the Hour of the Evil Eye and the catastrophe that destroyed High Atlantis. Later, Atlanteans, like modern humans, were hairless. Those of the oldest Atlantean ancestry tend to be rather furry.
George couldn't help looking down at Hagbard's hand as it rested on the railing. It was covered with thick black hair.
All right,
said Hagbard.
It's time to head back to our North American base. Howard, you out there?
The long, streamlined shape performed a somersault on their right.
What's happening, Hagbard? Have some of your people keep an eye on things here. We've got work to do on land. And Howard, as long as I live, I will be in debt to your people for the 4 who died to save me.
Haven't you and the Leif Erikson saved us from several kinds of deaths planned for us by the shore people?
Said Howard.
We'll keep watch over Atlantis for you and the seas in general and that which Atlantis has spawned. Hail and farewell, Hagbard and other friends. The sea is wide and the sea is deep, but warm as blood through it there rolls a tide of friendship that will keep us close in ocean's blackest holes.
He was gone.
Lift off,
Hagbard called. George felt the surge of the sub's colossal engines, and they were sailing high above the hills and valleys of Atlantis. With the special lighting of Hagbard's television screen system, it seemed much like flying in a jet plane over one of the continents above the ocean's surface.
Too bad we don't have time to get deeper into Atlantis,
said Hagbard.
There are many mighty cities to see, though of course none of them can approach the cities that existed before the Hour of the Evil Eye.
How many of these Atlantean civilizations were there?
Asked George.
Basically 2. One leading up to the hour, and one afterward. Before the hour, there was a civilization of about 1 million human beings on this continent. Technically, they were further advanced than the human race is today. They had atomic power, space travel, genetic technology, and much else. This civilization was struck a death blow in the Hour of the Evil Eye. 2/3 of them were killed, almost half the human population of the planet at that time. After the hour, something made it impossible for them to make a comeback. The cities that came through the first catastrophe relatively undamaged were destroyed in later disasters. The inhabitants of Atlantis were reduced to savagery in a generation. Part of the continent sank under the sea, which was the beginning of the process that ended when all of Atlantis was underwater as it is today.
Was this the earthquakes and tidal waves that you always read about?
George asked.
No,
said Hagbard with a curious, closed expression.
It was man-made. High Atlantis was destroyed in a kind of war, probably a civil war, since there was no other power on the planet that could have matched them.
Anyway, if there had been a victor, they'd still be around now,
said George.
They are,
said Mavis.
The victors are still around, only they're not what you might visualize, not a conquering nation. We are the descendants of the defeated. Now,
said Hagbard,
I'm going to show you something I promised when we first met. It has to do with the catastrophe I've been talking about. Look there.
The submarine had risen high above the continent, and it was possible to see landscapes stretching for hundreds of miles. Looking in the direction in which Hagbard pointed, George saw a vast expanse of black, glazed plain. Out of its centre jutted something white and pointed, like a canine tooth.
It is said of them that they even controlled the comets in their courses,
said Hagbard. He pointed again. The submarine sailed closer to the jutting white object. It was a four-sided white pyramid.
Don't say it,
said Mavis, giving him a warning look, and George remembered the tattoo he had seen between her breasts. He looked down again. They were above the pyramid now, and George could see the side that had been hidden from him as they approached. He saw what he had half feared, half expected to see, a blood-red design in the shape of a baleful eye.
The Pyramid of the Eye,
Hagbard said.
It stood in the center of the capital of High Atlantis. It was built in the last days of that civilization by the founders of the world's first religion. It doesn't look very big from up here, but it's 5 times the size of the Great Pyramid of Cheops, which was modeled after it. It's made of an imperishable ceramic substance which repels even ocean sediment, as if the builders knew that to last it would have to survive tens of thousands of years of ocean burial. And maybe, depending on who they were, they did know that. Or maybe they just built well in those days. Paos, as you saw, was a pretty durable city, and that was built after High Atlantis fell by the second civilization I spoke of. That second civilization reached a level somewhat more advanced than that of the Greeks and Romans, but it was nothing like its predecessor, and some malevolent force seemed bent on destroying it too, and it was destroyed about 10,000 years ago. Of that civilization, we have the evidence of ruins. But of High Atlantis, we have only records and legends dug up from later civilizations, and, of course, poetry from the Porpoise corpus. This is the only artifact, this pyramid, but its existence and durability prove that as long ago as 10 Egypts, a race of men existed whose technology was far advanced beyond what we know today. So advanced that it took 20,000 years for that civilization's successor culture to disappear completely. The men who destroyed High Atlantis did their best to make it disappear, but they couldn't quite manage it. The Pyramid of the Eye, for instance, is indestructible, though it's probable that they didn't want to destroy it.
Mavis nodded somberly.
That is their most sacred shrine. In other words,
said George,
you're telling me that the people who destroyed Atlantis still exist. Do they have the powers they had then? Substantially, yes,
said Hagbard.
Is this the Illuminati you told me about? Illuminati, or Ancient Illuminated Seers of Bavaria, is one of the names they have used, yes.
So they didn't start in 1776. They go a long way back before that, right?
Right,
said Mavis.
Then why did you lie to me about their history? And why the hell haven't they taken over the world by now, if they're all that powerful? When our ancestors were savages, they could have dominated them completely.
Hagbard replied,
I lied to you, because the human mind can only accept a little of the truth at a time. Also, initiation into Discordianism has stages. The answer to the other question is complicated, but I'll try to give it to you simply. There are 5 reasons. First, there are organizations like the Discordians, which are almost as powerful, and which know almost as much as the Illuminati, and which are able to thwart them. Second, the Illuminati are too small a group to enjoy the creative cross-fertilization necessary to progress of any kind. And they have been unable to advance much beyond the technological level they reached 30,000 years ago, like Chinese mandarins. Third, the Illuminati are hamstrung in their actions by the superstitious beliefs that set them apart from other Atlanteans. As I told you, they're the world's first religion. Fourth, the Illuminati are too sophisticated, ruthless, and decadent to want to take over the world. It amuses them to play with the world. Fifth, the Illuminati do rule the world, and everything that happens by their sufferance. Those reasons contradict each other,
said George.
That's the nature of logical thought. All propositions are true in some sense, false in some sense, and meaningless in some sense.
Hagbard didn't smile. The submarine had described a great arc as they talked, and now the Pyramid of the Eye was far behind them. The eye itself, since it faced eastward, was no longer visible. Below, George could see the ruins of several small cities at the edge of tall cliffs that fell away into darker depths. Cliffs that doubtless had been the seacoast of Atlantis at one time. Hagbard said,
I've got a job for you, George. You're going to like it, and you're going to want to do it. But it's going to make you shit a brick. We'll talk about it when we get to Chesapeake Base. Now, though, let's go down into the hold and have a look at our acquisitions.
He flicked a switch.
Fuck up. Get your finger out of your ass and drive this thing for a while. I'll see the statues later,
said Mavis.
I've got other things to do just now.
George followed Hagbard down carpeted staircases and halls panelled in glowing polished oak. At last they came to a large hall which was apparently paved with marble flagstones. A group of men and women wearing horizontally striped nautical shirts similar to Hagbard's were clustered around 4 tall statues in the centre of the room. When Hagbard entered the room, they stopped talking and stepped away to give him a clear look at the sculptures. The floor was covered with puddles of water, and the statues themselves were dripping.
No wiping them dry,
Hagbard said.
Every molecule is precious just as it is, and the less disturbed, the better.
He stepped closer to the nearest one and looked at it for a long moment.
What do you say about a thing like this? It's beyond exquisite. Can you imagine what their art was like before the disaster? And to think the unbroken circle destroyed every trace of it, except for that crude, stupid pyramid. Which is the greatest piece of ceramic technology in the history of the human race,
said one of the women. George looked around for Stella Maris, but she wasn't there.
Where's Stella?
He asked Hagbard.
Upstairs, minding the store. She'll see them later.
The sculptures were unlike the work of any culture George knew, which was to be expected after all. They were at once realistic, fanciful, and abstractly intellectual. They bore resemblance to Egyptian and Mayan, classical Greek, Chinese and Gothic, combined with a surprisingly modern-looking note. There were some qualities in the statues that were totally unique, though qualities doubtless lost by the civilizations to which Atlantis was ancestral, but that might have been found in known world art had there been other civilizations to preserve and emphasize them. This, George realized, was the art, and looking at the statues was like hearing a sentence in the first language spoken by men. An elderly sailor, pointing at the statue farthest from where they were standing,
"Look at that beatific smile. A woman thought of that statue, I bet. That's every woman's dream, to be totally self-sufficient."
"Some of the time, Joshua,"
said the Oriental woman who hadn't spoken before.
"but not all of the time. Now, what I prefer is that."
She pointed to another statue. Hagbard laughed.
"You think that's just nice, healthy originalism, Sushi.
But the child in the woman's arms is the son without a father, the self-begotten, and the couple at the base represent the unbroken circle of Gruad. Usually it's a serpent with its tail in its mouth, but in some of the earlier representations, the couple in oral intercourse symbolizes sterile lust. The unloved mother has her foot on the man's head to indicate that she conquers lust. The whole sculpture is the product of the foulest cult to come out of Atlantis. They originated human sacrifice. First, they practiced castration, but then they escalated to killing men instead of just cutting off their balls. Later, when women were subjugated, the sacrifice became a virgin female, supposedly to give her to the unloved ones while she was still pure. That halo around the child's head looks like the peace symbol,
said George.
Peace symbol, my ass,
said Hagbard.
That's the oldest symbol of evil there is. Of course, in the cult of the unbroken circle, it was a symbol of good, but that's the same difference. They can't have been so vicious if they produced that statue,
said the Oriental woman stubbornly.
Could you deduce the Spanish Inquisition from the painting of the manger at Bethlehem?
Said Hagbard.
Don't be naive, Miss Mao.
He turned to George.
The value of any one of these statues is beyond calculation, but not many people know that. I'm sending you to one who does. Robert Putney Drake. One of the finest art connoisseurs in the world and the head of the American branch of the World Crime Syndicate. You're going to see him with a gift from me. These 4 statues. The Illuminati were planning to buy his support with gold from the Temple of Tethys. I'm going to get to him first. If they only needed 4 statues, why were they trying to raise the whole temple?
George asked.
I think they wanted to remove the temple to Agarthy, their stronghold under the Himalayas, for safekeeping. I haven't been any closer to the Temple of Tethys than we were today, but I suspect it's a treasure house of evidence of High Atlantis. As such, it would be something the Illuminati would want to remove. Until now, there was no reason to, because no one had access to the sea bottom other than the Illuminati. Now I can get around down here just as well, better in fact than they can, and pretty soon others will be following. Several nations and many groups of private persons are exploring the undersea world. It's time for the Illuminati to finish taking away whatever tells of High Atlantis. Will they destroy that city we saw? And what about the Pyramid of the Eye?
Hagbard shook his head.
They'd be willing to let later Atlantean ruins to be found. That wouldn't say anything about their existence. As for the Pyramid of the Eye, I suspect they have a real problem with that. They can't destroy it, and even if they could, they wouldn't want to, but it's a dead giveaway to the existence of a super-civilization in the past. Well,
said George, not at all wanting to meet the head of the American crime syndicate.
What we ought to do is go back and raise the Temple of Tethys ourselves, before the Illuminati grab it. Good grief,
said Miss Mao.
This happens to be the most critical moment in the history of this civilization. We don't have time to fiddle-fuck around with archaeology.
He's just a legionnaire,
said Hagbard.
Though after this mission, he'll know the fairest and become a deacon. He'll understand more then. George, I want you to act as a go-between for the Discordian movement and the Syndicate. You're going to bring these 4 statues to Robert Putney Drake and tell him there are more where they came from. Ask Drake to stop working for the Illuminati, to take the heat off our people, wherever he's after them, and to drop the assassination project the Illuminati have been working on with him. And as an earnest of good faith, he's to snuff 24 Illuminati agents for us in the next 24 hours. Their names will be contained in a sealed envelope, which you will give him.
5s. Sex. Here is wisdom. The mumble of the breast is the mutter of man. State's Attorney Milo A. Flanagan stood on the roof of the high-rise condominium on Lakeshore Drive in which he lived, scanning blue-grey Lake Michigan with powerful binoculars. It was April the 24th, and Project Tethys should be completed. At any moment, Flanagan expected to sight what would look like another Great Lakes freighter heading for the Chicago River locks. only this one would be carrying a dismantled Atlantean temple crated in its hold. The ship would be recognisable by a red triangle painted on the funnel. After being inspected by Flanagan, whose name in the order was Brother Johann Beghard, and after his report had been sent to the Vigilance Lodge, the North American Command Centre, the crated temple would be moved downriver to St. Louis, where by prior agreement with the President of the United States, it would be trucked overland to Fort Knox, under the guard of the U.S. Army. The President didn't know with whom he was dealing. The CIA had informed him that the source of the artifacts was the Livonian nationalist movement now behind the Iron Curtain, and that the crates would contain Livonian art treasures. Certain high officers in the CIA did know the real nature of the organisation which the US was helping because they were members of it. Of course, the syndicate, without even a cover story, was keeping 3/4 of its gold in with the government store at Fort Knox these days.
Where could you find a safer place?
Robert Putney Drake once asked. But the freighter was behind schedule. The wind battered at Flanagan, whipping his wavy white hair and the well-tailored jacket sleeves and trouser legs. The goddamn Chicago wind. Flanagan had been fighting it all his life. It had made him the man he was. Police Sergeant Otto Waterhouse emerged from the doorway to the roof. Waterhouse was a member of Flanagan's personal staff, which meant he was on the police department payroll, the syndicate payroll, and another payroll that regularly deposited a fixed sum in the account of Herr Otto Wasserhaus in a Bavarian bank. Waterhouse was a 6.5-foot tall black man who had made a career for himself in the Chicago Police Department by being more willing and eager to harass, torture, maim and kill members of his race than the average Mississippi sheriff. Flanagan had early spotted Waterhouse's ice-cold, self-hating love affair with death and had attached him to his staff.
A message from CFR Communications Center in New York,
said Waterhouse.
The word has come through from Ingolstadt that Project Tethys was aborted.
Flanagan lowered his binoculars and turned to look at Waterhouse. The state's attorney's florid face, with its bushy pepper and salt eyebrows, was shrewd and distinguished. The sort of face people vote for, especially in Chicago. It was a face that had once belonged to a kid who had run with the hamburgers in Chicago's South Side Irish ghetto and bashed out the brains of black men with cobblestones for the fun of it. It was a face that had come from that primitive beginning to knowing about 10,000-year-old sunken temples, spider ships and international conspiracies. It was stamped indelibly with the lines of Milo A. Flanagan's ancestors, the ancestors of the Gauls, Britons, Scots, Picts, Welsh and Irish. Around the time the Temple of Tethys was sinking into the sea, they had been driven forth on orders from Agati, from that thick ancient forest that is now the desert country of Outer Mongolia. But Flanagan was only a 4th-degree Illuminatus and not fully instructed in the history. Though he did not display much emotion, there were blue-white flames of murderous madness burning deep in his eyes. Waterhouse was one of the few people in Chicago who could meet Flanagan's baleful stare head-on.
How did it happen?
Flanagan asked.
They were attacked by porpoises and invisible submarine. The spider craft were all blown to bits. The Zvak came in and counterattacked, was damaged by a laser beam and forced to disengage.
How did they find out we had spider ships at the temple site?
Maybe the porpoises told them.
Flanagan looked at Waterhouse coldly and thoughtfully.
Maybe it was leaked at this end, Otto. There are jams active in this town, more here than anywhere in the country right now. Dillinger's been spotted twice in the last week. By Gruat, how I'd like to be the one to really get him, once and for all. What would Hoover's ghost say then, huh, Otto?
Flanagan grinned, one of his rare, genuine smiles, exposing prominent canine teeth.
We know there's a jam cult center somewhere on the north side. Someone's been stealing hosts from my brother's church for the past 10 years. even at times when I've had as many as 30 men staked out there. And my brother says there have been more cases of demonic possession in his parish in the last 5 years than in all of Chicago in all its previous history. One of our sensitives has reported emanations of the old woman in this area at least once a month during the past year. It's a long past time we found them. They could be reading our minds, Otto. That could be the leak. Why haven't we got a fix on them?
Waterhouse, who only a few years ago had known nothing more unconventional than how to turn a homicide into killed while resisting arrest, looked back calmly at Flanagan and said,
"We need 10 sensitives of the 5th grade to perform the pentacle, and we've only got 7.
Flanagan shook his head.
There are 17 5th graders in Europe, 8 in Africa, and 23 scattered around the rest of the world. You'd think they could spare us 3 for a week. That's all it would take."
Waterhouse said,
"Maybe you've got enemies in the higher circle. Maybe somebody wants to see us get it." "Why the hell do you say things like that, Waterhouse?" "Just to fuck you up, man."
8 floors below, in an apartment which was regularly used for black masses, a North Clark Street hippie named Skip Lynch opened his eyes and looked at Simon Moon and Padre Pederastia.
"Time's getting very short,"
he said.
"We gotta finish our Flanagan soon."
"It can't be too soon for me,"
said Padre Pederastia.
"If Daddy hadn't favored him so outrageously, he'd be the priest today, and I'd be state's attorney."
Simon nodded.
"But then we'd be snuffing you instead of Milo. Anyway, I believe George Dorn will be taking care of the problem for us right now.